The Books of Maccabees offer spiritual wisdom that might leave you in awe. They cover a period of Jewish history when the very existence of the Jewish faith was under attack by the Seleucid Empire, particularly under the oppressive reign of King Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His attempts to eradicate Judaism, impose Hellenistic culture, and replace Jewish traditions with pagan worship are nothing short of brutal. In this video, we will take a deep dive into all three of the books, uncovering the extraordinary stories they contain. Imagine this: the spark of one of the most significant rebellions in Jewish history begins with a single act of defiance. The first Book of Maccabees is more than just a story of war. It is a profound narrative of faith under fire, where the very identity of the Jewish people was at risk. This ancient text, excluded from many Christian Bibles, holds some of the most inspiring moments of faith, resistance, and miraculous victories you've never heard of. The Maccabean Revolt took place in the 2nd century BC, at a time when the Jewish people were forced to abandon their sacred traditions. The Seleucid Empire, under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, sought to erase Judaism and replace it with Hellenistic culture and pagan worship. The desecration of the temple in Jerusalem and the decree to offer sacrifices to Zeus were among the many actions that threatened the very foundation of the Jewish faith. For many Jews, this was a line they could not cross. Just as Daniel and his friends stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, refusing to bow down to the golden statue, the Jews in 1st Maccabees were faced with the same dilemma: forsake their faith or face death. This rebellion mirrors the trials faced by faithful believers throughout the Bible, where standing firm for God meant risking everything. The first Book of Maccabees begins with a courageous act of resistance. A priest named Mattathias was confronted by royal officials who demanded he offer a pagan sacrifice. In a moment of righteous fury, Mattathias refused and killed the official who was enforcing the king's decree. This single act of defiance ignited the Maccabean Revolt, a movement that would preserve Judaism in one of its darkest hours. Mattathias' stand for his faith echoes the zeal of Phinehas in Numbers 25, 7-13, who defended the holiness of God by slaying those who violated the covenant. Mattathias' bold act inspired others to join the cause, and after his death, the leadership of the revolt passed to his son, Judas Maccabeus. Known as the Hammer, Judas became a legendary military leader. Despite facing a vastly superior force, Judas and his followers repeatedly defeated the mighty Seleucid armies, achieving victories that were viewed as miraculous interventions by God. The first Book of Maccabees reveals how these victories were not merely military, but seen as signs of divine intervention. Just as Gideon's small army in Judges 7 overcame impossible odds, Judas and his followers believed that God was guiding them to victory. Before each battle, they called upon God, trusting that He would be their strength. When Judas saw the overwhelming enemy forces, he turned to his men and declared, "Let us not fear the numbers, but trust in the Lord of heaven, who is mighty to save." Their faith was rewarded time and again, as the Jewish forces under Judas Maccabeus won battle after battle, driving out the Seleucid forces and reclaiming their land. The faith of these fighters was not merely military, but deeply spiritual. Their unwavering belief in God's protection and intervention made their triumphs not just victories in battle, but testimonies of divine power. As the Maccabean Revolt gained momentum, it was not just military victories that defined the struggle for Jewish faith and identity. The second Book of Maccabees turns our attention to the personal sacrifices and martyrs whose unwavering devotion to their beliefs became symbols of resistance and hope. In this powerful text, we are introduced to the stories of individuals whose faith in God allowed them to endure unimaginable suffering for the sake of preserving their covenant with God. The second Book of Maccabees opens with a detailed account of the Jewish martyrs who were brutally executed under Antiochus IV's regime. These accounts are not only poignant, but also profoundly spiritual, as they demonstrate the resolve of men and women who refuse to betray their faith, even when faced with death. The most famous story in this book is that of a mother and her 7 sons who were tortured to death one by one before her eyes. When the king demanded that they eat pork, a forbidden food in Judaism, the sons refused, choosing instead to die rather than defile themselves. Their steadfast commitment to their faith was unshakable. One by one, each son was executed, and the mother, witnessing the gruesome deaths of her children, remained resolute. Her final words, before she too was executed, are immortalized in the text. "I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you life and breath, but the Creator of the world who shaped the beginning of man and devised the origin of all things. He will, in His mercy, give you back both breath and life, whoever the obey is." This story of the mother and her 7 sons illustrates not only the depth of their faith, but also the strength of their hope in resurrection. Despite the physical torment, they remained certain that God would restore them in the life to come. Their unwavering belief in life after death and their loyalty to God's commandments made them stand out as powerful symbols of resistance. These acts of courage and defiance against an oppressive regime exemplify what it means to truly live by faith, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The second Book of Maccabees also recounts miraculous occurrences that reassured the Jewish people of God's presence among them during their time of suffering. One such miracle is the story of the resurrection of the dead. The book tells of the martyrdom of a group of Jewish warriors who, upon hearing the account of the mother and her sons, were inspired to fight for their faith. They were martyred for refusing to abandon God's law. After their deaths, their bodies were miraculously found intact, a sign that God had accepted their sacrifice and would resurrect them in the afterlife. These miracles were signs that God was actively present in their struggle and that even in death, faithfulness to Him would be rewarded. The second book highlights a critical moment of Jewish history when faith was not just a personal conviction, but a collective call to arms, both spiritual and literal. The third Book of Maccabees is often considered the most dramatic and mysterious of the Maccabean books. While it is not always grouped with the first and second books of Maccabees in certain biblical traditions, it offers its own distinct contribution to the story of divine intervention and protection. This book recounts the persecution of the Jews in Egypt under King Ptolemy IV, a ruler known for his cruelty and disregard for the Jewish people. The Jewish community in Egypt was under threat, facing not only religious oppression, but also the risk of annihilation. In one of the most vivid accounts, the king orders the Jews to be thrown into a large amphitheater filled with wild animals. But through divine intervention, the Jews are miraculously spared. Just as the first book of Maccabees showed God's power in military victories, and the second book of Maccabees demonstrated His presence in moments of martyrdom, the third book shows His divine protection in times of persecution. The Jews in Egypt are saved by a series of miracles that occur just when all hope seems lost. As the king's decree is carried out, the animals in the amphitheater refuse to harm the Jews, and the very forces of nature seem to rally behind them. This miraculous preservation of life serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most dire circumstances, God's protection is ever present. It shows that no matter how deep the persecution, no matter how dark the times, God is a refuge for His people. Additionally, the third book of Maccabees touches upon themes of divine wrath. It suggests that those who persecute the righteous will ultimately face the consequences of their actions. King Ptolemy III, in his attempt to destroy the Jews, faces the wrath of God, and his kingdom falls into turmoil. This serves as a powerful reminder of the biblical principle that those who harm God's people will ultimately suffer. The books of Maccabees continue to speak powerfully to us today. Their stories of faith, sacrifice, and divine intervention transcend the events of their time, offering lessons that remain relevant to every generation. These texts teach us that faith is not passive. It is an active force that calls us to stand firm, to resist oppression, and to trust in God's provision, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Whether it is the courageous leadership of Judas Maccabeus, the heroic martyrdom of the mother and her sons, or the miraculous protection of the Jewish people in Egypt, the Maccabees remind us that God is present in every battle, big or small. And, as the books of Maccabees show us, even when the world seems against us, we can always rely on God's strength, mercy, and guidance. These books challenge us to question our own faith in times of adversity. When we face our own struggles, whether personal or societal, the examples of the Maccabean heroes remind us that we are not alone. God is with us, and His promises are unwavering. As we conclude this journey through the books of Maccabees, we leave with the enduring legacy of their message, that faith, even in the darkest of times, is the key to overcoming any obstacle. Whether through victory on the battlefield, through sacrifice in the face of death, or through divine miracles in times of persecution, the books of Maccabees call us to embrace our faith with the same fervor and dedication that these ancient heroes did.